Hey Bob, welcome back to another episode of Between Whatever We're Between.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we're between continents. We're between different seasons of the year. We're between some technological difficulties, and we're managing just fine. I'm
Yeah,
happy to be here. I wondered if you'd be interested in introducing kind of our discussion. Ian, you go where you want to go, and I'll follow. We'll do
yeah,
that.
yeah. I'll just let the we are recording this for people to pick up along the way if they choose to, and it'll be a shortened version because we had some technical difficulties with a new program. So here we are, and just prior to coming in, Bob, we were talking about the Martin Buber thou and how that looks. And then I thought it'd be a good idea to talk to the between and what that means. We just jumped into doing these calls together and these recordings and then putting them up on the YouTube or whatever, but we've never really spoken into what that means to what the between means and how that looks in recovery from addiction and coming out of isolation into a relationship with another and seeing the person as a person rather than just an object that we can because in addiction we can very easily get into there's a person in front of me or there's something in front of me, what can I get out of it and what does it look like to see your fellow recovering person, mate, whatever the political correct is around that, and bringing some compassion and kindness into the relationship rather than what can I get out of it. Yeah. And I wonder what your thoughts would be around that, Bob.
I just had a flash as I was listening to you, Ian. I haven't thought about this in some time. About 50 years ago, I was my first experience of organized religion, and I got involved in conservative Christianity, happened to be the stripe I got involved in. After a few years on that, I found myself dissatisfied with the dogmatic emphasis. I think that worked for some people. It didn't work very well for me. And I found myself very drawn, this is back in the 1970s, to what was then called relational theology. I haven't thought about this in years. So I was reading evangelical authors, but they were very much focused on the relationship. In fact, our local congregation, somebody came up from Los Angeles. I lived in Central California. Somebody came up from Los Angeles, and I remember him speaking. It was my first introduction to Martin Buber. And it was a very unlikely location because the church I was going to would not have been progressive in terms of theology and certainly not Judaism friendly. So there I was listening to Martin Buber. It left quite an impact on me. Introduced the idea of dialogue and so on. And then when I went to graduate school, that's the end of the 70s, early 80s, I really dived deeply into the work of Martin Buber. I read book after book by him. I was really impacted by him in a very favorable way. And I think what touched me, I went through a crisis of faith. This is long before my own recovery, but it impacted my recovery. I went through a crisis of faith during that time because the conventional God and the theology that went with that, it left me really dry. I couldn't find my way back into it anymore. For a period of time it worked and then it stopped working. What really inspired me and what really gave me courage was the way that Martin Buber talked about God. He referred to God as the between. And that I could understand. I could understand my connection to others. I struggled with it, but I could understand my connection to a higher power, as in God. I could understand the between. And then I read a poem by Robert Bly right about that time called The Third Body. And I memorized that poem. I've since recited that poem at a few weddings, including recently, where Robert Bly picks up on this same idea. It's picked up on different traditions. The poet Rumi out of the Sufi tradition talks beautifully about a third entity coming in. But Robert Bly wrote about a third body, and he's writing a poem. It's a love poem to his wife. It's between a man and a woman. But the way he talked about giving substance to the between really resonated for me. Again, very much in that sense of Martin Buber. And let me flash forward then to tie it into addiction recovery, and then I want to hand the gavel to you, is when I got into recovery, not only was my addiction increasingly isolating, but the shame that attended my hitting bottom and getting into recovery, that shame isolated me. I did not want to stay open to, I didn't want to hear about the between. The between felt dangerous and painful to me. And for me, as you know, I was involved in not one, not two, but 3 different recovery groups. And I evidently needed a lot of help. And all of them gave me an opportunity to do something that now comes naturally to me. Just earlier today, as it turns out, I'm here in the US, here in Australia. I met with a family from different parts of the country on Zoom. They're reaching out to me for recovery coaching for their son/husband. And I was open with them not only about my own being in recovery, but I accentuated how valuable their presence could be in helping their son/husband to address his alcoholism. And I know it firsthand. This isn't out of textbooks, but it's almost like Buber applied the idea that even at my lowest point, maybe in some ways, especially at my lowest point, that's where, however you understand God, has the most opportunity to come in and transform our lives. So that at the very bottom of the barrel for me, what's called hitting bottom in the 12-step programs, as I hit bottom and smashed into the bottom, I felt something open up, and that opening up felt like a miracle to me. It didn't turn me into a conventional religious person. I'm not very conventional in any regard. It turned me into a very humble, surrendered posture towards what was happening. And I remember thinking then, as I felt this between in my life, for some reason, I didn't feel shame in the presence of what I felt that had been admitted into my soul. I remember thinking, I've shared this with you before, I remember thinking, I was in the hospital for addiction. I remember thinking, there'll come a day, and it won't be in the too distant future, that I'm going to be nostalgic for this moment of clarity. And I came to be that way. There was something about that pure, essential between that was revealed to me at the very bottom of the barrel as I began to look towards rising again, that is in recovery, that I've always looked back. I never did forget that experience. And although it's still with me and I work on cultivating it, I'm probably the most interested in what we're talking about here. Is there something between you and me, Ian? There's something between me and those that I love, the same for you. And there's something between each one of us respectively in our higher power that's at the heart of my own recovery process. Thanks for being patient with that long response to a simple question.
No, absolutely. I think it's an important discussion. Both you and myself can sit down and talk about Buber as though he's a long lost friend there somewhere, but the average person listening in, some people will have an idea who Martin Buber was, the Jewish mystic who was nominated for a Nobel Prize for his work around the I thou, and then to bring it back into recovery, just to keep it simple as we do. I was talking to a dear friend yesterday about, we're both in recovery and over a cup of coffee and hitting bottom. And we've no idea of any of these concepts. Most of these concepts and ideas have come to me in my professional training, the majority of them, and some have come through 12-step programs. And sitting there and remembering my bottom and what happened for me when I hit bottom, and then what we started to talk about was in that moment of surrender. It's that one, powerlessness, and understanding and feeling the powerlessness, and surrendering and accepting that place that I found myself in all those years ago. the magic for me, if there is a magic or the miracle for me, is that moment of grace. That Jung talks about that conversion experience, and it's a deep psychic shift. You know, the 12-step programs talk about, you know, the ego death, you know, and letting go to the maximum. And I can think about letting go. I can think about, well, if that's what's needed, and listening in 12-step programs, well, that's what's needed. But then I can't go out there and manifest it just because I need to do that to run the program or run the 12 steps. There is this deeper letting go, this deeper surrendering, this moment of grace where the conversion happens. It's a switch. And when it happened for me all those years ago, and I said on these recordings before, that was 33, 34 years ago, and I haven't drunk from that moment to this. Now, if I read Bill Wilson, which I'm doing at the moment, through his conversations with Jung, Wilson talks about the same. He talks about, well, having his white light happening in the hospital, and then not drinking from that day to this. It doesn't make the path easy, but I tell you what, it gave me a point of reference. There's something shifted inside me that just allowed me to leave alcohol behind, yeah, and other drugs, yeah.
I think this is a good introduction. We're going to have to wind down owing to our time today. It's a good introduction. I'd love to follow on this more with you. I love the way that we dived right into the between, respectively, our experiences around that. I also like how it is that we have different paths. In some ways, I was familiar with Buber before I became addicted. We've talked about this before. We both have an interest in integral recovery related to Ken Wilber. I did my dissertation years and years and years before. My dissertation was rooted in Ken Wilber's work. And then when I got into recovery from addiction, I realized I needed it to be informed by Martin Buber because I valued him so much, or I needed to be informed by the work of Ken Wilber because I valued that as well. So I just lucked out. I lucked out because I found people like you and our friends John Dupuy and others that had gone that way before me, and it's made all the difference. Why don't we wind up for here if that's okay with you, and then we'll pick up in the next meeting and maybe continue this conversation. I love where we're going with it. I love the flow between us. Speaking of the between.
Yeah, I do too. I enjoy this time together. Well, it's,
thank you.
I feel blessed and that we can do this. Yeah.
Me too. Me too. I'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, my friend. Take good care of your blessings to you till then.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye for now.
Yeah.